Welcome to Walden Pod. I'm your host, Emerson Green. So this is not a why I'm leaving the skeptic community video, because I haven't been a part of the skeptic community for years at this point. Of course, my experiences from within the community from about 2015 to 2019 might not reflect yours. It seems that the character of the skeptic community has changed in the intervening years, especially politically. I'm only speaking to my experiences, the stories I heard, things I saw, etc., when I was an active member of the online skeptic community. I'd also urge you not to take this as some kind of theory about the skeptic community followed by endnotes and citations. This is a mostly disorganized and incomplete story about how I gravitated towards a certain group and about how I drifted away. I don't begrudge anyone who wants to remain a part of the skeptic community, I just don't fit in there. In a nutshell, I think that genuine skepticism is far less important to the skeptic community than the kinds of conclusions that one comes to. Much of the skeptic community just doesn't live up to its professed values, and many of the leaders of the skeptic community have proven themselves to be untrustworthy sources of information on the topics they speak about. They've misled me often about what others believe and why. And I'll just say I have another related episode planned about the pointlessness of informal logical fallacies. This is also an attack on skeptics, since the invocation of informal fallacies constitutes about 90% of skeptics' reasoning capacities. So, the skeptic community, for me, was composed of a handful of organizations, online groups, podcasts, and figureheads. CFI, the James Randi Educational Foundation, the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, the New Atheists, and various online groups, smaller podcasts, and so on. They organized events like The Amazing Meeting, Skepticon, and other conferences and conventions that discussed skepticism, atheism, science education, activism, and other related things. What are they skeptical of? God, Bigfoot, parapsychology, conspiracy theories, homeopathy, dualism, aliens, and other things they deem to be irrational or pseudoscientific. According to them, people only believe in God, conspiracy theories, souls, aliens, and so on because they suffer from cognitive biases and are prone to committing informal logical fallacies. So that's a very loose description of what the skeptic community is, what they believe, and why I have a problem with them. To reiterate, a number of skeptics fail to live up to their professed values, including many leaders in the skeptic community who have repeatedly proven themselves to be untrustworthy sources of information on the topics they speak about. And their analysis of why people believe what they believe, for example in this book I have in my hand, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, is astonishingly superficial. And to be clear, it's not all binary here. I respect many skeptics and I would vouch for a good deal of them. One more disclaimer. I would ask for a bit of charity in this episode, which I realize is asking a lot given the topic and how I'm approaching it. The reason is that I recorded this for patrons originally, but at their prompting decided to release it to everyone else. And when I was recording this, I was drinking a bit, as you'll see in the video. And at a few points, I chose to use highly incendiary examples to make a point when I could have opted for examples that weren't so controversial. Typically, I see theism versus atheism taken as a case to make some of the points I'll be making, but I chose to rely mainly on conspiracy theories instead. So, for the same reason some atheists are called crypto-theists for failing to have a sufficiently crude, oversimplified, black and white understanding of theism that never strays from a disparaging tone, I know I'll be called a conspiracy theorist. And that really can't be helped. For many skeptics, you cannot talk about these subjects in anything other than an uncompromisingly derisive way, so someone like me who refuses to do that is liable to be ejected from the tribe. So you may not agree with me at certain points. That's bound to happen since I have a fairly idiosyncratic web of beliefs, but you can always count on the fact that I will be honest with you. Well, strap in everybody, because we're talking about JFK, 9/11, and yes, aliens. I went to some skeptic meetups. I listened to skeptic podcasts, was a part of skeptic groups online, and I no longer think of myself as a skeptic. I haven't for a long time. I was kind of into it when I was 19, 20, 21, and I just slowly was repelled by it. There are two meanings of skeptic here. The literal meaning of being a skeptic is just applying a certain method to claims about the world, and if a claim can survive the acid of skepticism, then it stands a better chance of being true. And an idea that withers under skeptical inquiry stands less of a chance of being true. It's probably not worth believing. But then there's the other meaning of skeptic, which is basically just someone who goes off of vibes, and they use this vibes-based approach to figure out what they should or shouldn't believe purely based on connotations. What's the respectable sounding thing to believe? What is the official narrative, of every single facet of life? And I'm going to adopt that. Actually, I have something pulled up here from Skeptic magazine, run by Michael Shermer, who's a bit of an exception to this, which I'll get to. But here's the thing from skeptic.com. Some people believe that skepticism is the rejection of new ideas, or worse, they confuse skeptic with cynic, and think that skeptics are a bunch of grumpy curmudgeons unwilling to accept any claim that challenges the status quo. This is wrong. Skepticism is a provisional approach to claims. It is the application of reason to any and all ideas, no sacred cows allowed. You get the idea here. So that description at the beginning is a pretty good description of James Randi, actually. Cynic, grumpy curmudgeon, unwilling to accept any claim that challenges the status quo, the uncritical rejection of new ideas. That's about him. James Randi was a magician. He debunked paranormal claims, like Uri Geller's spoon-bending shit, stuff like that. And then he founded the JREF, which is like a nonprofit educational organization. And he put together the well-known $1 Million Paranormal Challenge, which was a totally real offer. He's venerated in the skeptic community. He's a bit of a sacred cow. And, like I said, I don't think that's true of someone like Michael Shermer, who I disagree with about all sorts of things, but I think he's like a good faith actor who approaches questions sincerely with an open mind. I think that he's persuadable on a range of issues. I feel like when he speaks with people, there's an actual conversation happening. There's always a certain type of person. They might be left-wing or right-wing or woke or anti-woke or whatever. But there are certain types of people who are just more open to debate and more open to hearing someone out and having a dialogue in good faith. And Ben Burgess is someone who's like that, who's a socialist and a lefty, and Michael Shermer is someone who I think is like that, and he's more of a right-leaning libertarian, maybe a left-leaning libertarian, I don't know. But the point is, I have respect for people like Michael Shermer, even though I don't agree with him about a whole range of issues. And I don't respect James Randi. I think he's a pseudo-skeptic. I think that Michael Shermer and James Randi are not the same person and shouldn't go in the same bucket. So why is that? What is the problem with James Randi exactly? Well, I've already sort of outlined it. I think he was just someone who uncritically rejected ideas that didn't have a certain vibe to them, which is true of a lot of people in the skeptic community. They just kind of, they just kind of accept the status quo as handed down to them by academics, by corporate media. They just sort of uncritically believe the people who present themselves as the rational adults in the room. It doesn't really matter what they're saying, it just matters how they present themselves. The aesthetics of rationality in science is their guiding light, not rationality in science, the aesthetics of it. So having beliefs that seem to be in accordance with science is way more important than any actual pursuit of truth. That would be messy and difficult, and it might lead you to uncomfortable places. But just having a predetermined list of what is or isn't true based on its connotations, it's much easier. Conspiracy theories, false by definition. It's a conspiracy theory. It goes against the official narrative, so it can't be true. skeptics rarely believe anything that's labeled a conspiracy theory, even when it turns out to be totally true. They don't reason about the individual case. They always just say the same list of kind of predetermined things like, oh, it would involve so many people. There's no way that there wouldn't be a whistleblower or someone who let it slip, you know?
Point. Yeah, I read. Who's the guy that developed uh, the U-2 spy plane? Ben Rich, I think his name was, at Boeing in Burbank, California, right here in LA.
Right.
And this went on for decades, and no one knew that they were doing this right there with hundreds of people sworn to secrecy. So it does kind of counter that my conspiracy skepticism that people can't really keep secrets. Sometimes they can. I mean, apparently, you working for the Ministry of Defense, you had certain amount of security clearance, and you saw things that you probably can't tell us on the show today or ever. So maybe it is possible for people to keep secrets like that.
Sure. I mean, it's one of those things. I was in the Ministry of Defense for 21 years and know a lot of things that are secret that haven't come out on a whole range of subjects, whether it's Iraq or counterterrorism or whatever it is. And of course, people have this thing like, oh, see, you can't keep a secret. And then, of course, they cite, because they can only cite, secrets which have been revealed, either because they have been declared or leaked or whatever, but they can't and don't cite secrets that have been kept, and secrets are being kept every day in most government agencies, and a lot of this is obviously fairly low-level stuff, but I guarantee there are some pretty big secrets out there that have been kept for decades.
Right. Well, sure. There's going to be more probably about JFK assassination and who knows what else, and we won't know until we know.
So in the intro, I mentioned how I thought that the analysis offered by many skeptics of why people believe what they believe is quite superficial. So here's an example of what I mean by that. Quote, "There appears to be some basic psychology at work. We tend to assume that big events must have big causes. It just doesn't sit right with us to think that a major world event with significant historical implications was pulled off by some lone nut job. That's partly why a majority of Americans still believe in a JFK conspiracy, even after 50 years with no real evidence coming to light to support it." I literally could not come up with a lazier explanation of why people doubt the Warren Commission if I tried. I've heard this from multiple skeptics. You know, I remember John Oliver did an episode on conspiracy theories, and he said the same thing. I mean, obviously, he has writers, and I'm sure the writers got some of their material from skeptics. I wanted to read this quote from Spinoza. "I have made a ceaseless effort not to ridicule, not to bewail, not to scorn human actions, but to understand them." I think that's a pretty good attitude to have towards other people, especially if they believe weird things. And I don't think that skeptics are really exemplars of that attitude. As I said, there are exceptions to this rule. Like, for instance, Michael Shermer has a book, Why People Believe Weird Things, and I liked the chapters of that book that I read. I just played a clip of Michael Shermer undermining the common conventional line from skeptics that's kind of their catch-all. No matter what you're talking about, no matter what conspiracy you're talking about, they have this canned line that they throw out there regardless of the specific facts or the history or whatever, about how just too many people couldn't keep a secret. So in honor of skeptics, I'm going to refer to this as the toupee fallacy. I know they tend to understand things better when you put it in fallacy form. So this is the toupee fallacy. It's like saying, I can always tell when someone is wearing a toupee. Well, how would you know? I mean, you've seen people who are wearing toupees and you go, that's a toupee. But maybe many people have walked by you wearing one and you didn't notice it because it was a really good one. So you shouldn't say things like, I can always tell when someone is wearing a toupee, because necessarily you can only refer to the ones who are wearing a bad toupee. So that whole chapter on conspiracy theories in the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, first of all, it attributes every conspiratorial belief to cognitive biases and logical fallacies. And also, as you heard, this psychoanalysis that people just can't believe that, big events could have small causes or something. Additionally, they emphasize that you can't keep secrets among a good number of people. So they start off with this quote that says, the government kind of sucks at keeping secrets. Well, how is that not the same thing as saying I can always tell when someone's wearing a toupee? You can only refer to the secrets that weren't kept. They isolate the craziest exponent of that idea, then they debunk the crazy guy, and then they say, therefore, this has been debunked. So conspiracy theories, false by definition. And the same holds with everything that doesn't have the right feel to it. Take like alien abductions or UFO sightings. There's nothing in conflict with with natural law or naturalism or atheism to say that, the same thing that happened here on Earth might have happened somewhere else. There are reasons for thinking that not every UFO sighting is like illegitimate, just a priori. Sometimes people try to give these a priori arguments against genuine UFO sightings or genuine parapsychological phenomena. A priori is not exactly right, but what I mean is like before they look at the evidence of that specific case. So Sean Carroll makes this type of argument against parapsychology where he says, look, we have the core theory and the core theory is right and the core theory will always be right. It is never moving. It is never changing. It is this solid, immutable piece of knowledge that rules out every type of parapsychological phenomenon. So we never have to actually investigate any of these claims. We already know they're wrong because they're in conflict with physics, which is apparently tentative in all respects except for this one. But he has some more reasoning for it. It's like, any particle or field or whatever that would have an effect is either like too weak to be noticed or something else. I can't remember exactly what the argument is off the top of my head because I don't have it here in front of me. But basically, any parapsychological phenomena would come in conflict with the core theory. We know the core theory is right. And then there's a bit more of an argument to why he thinks the core theory is a perfect description of the everyday world, or not perfect, but good to such a high degree of accuracy that we know that there's no such thing as genuine parapsychology. So people do the same thing with UFO sightings where they try to say, oh, it would have to be light years away and physical bodies or organic bodies couldn't travel that fast. No physical thing could travel as fast as would be necessary to travel the distances that would be required. And, you can dig into these claims and you can cast doubt on them for a variety of reasons. And many people have done so. And you know how I know about this? In part because of Michael Shermer, who actually speaks to these people. So there are genuine skeptics out there, but I just would never consider myself a part of the skeptic community because people like Michael Shermer are few and far between. Most of them are like James Randi. Before we get to James Randi, just one more thing about the alien thing. So Avi Loeb has exposed this tendency of many self-identified skeptics of going off of aesthetics and vibes and connotations. So he's been making the case publicly. He's a Harvard astronomer, and he's been making the case publicly that this strange object named Oumuamua that blew through our solar system a few years ago, he's saying, hey, this could be an artificial object because it doesn't have any of the characteristics of a natural object. It is the first interstellar visitor that we have. It's the first one, and it doesn't fit the characteristics of any known natural object. And he was like, just statistically, this is so unexpected, that a heretofore unknown natural object would be the first interstellar visitor. It's so statistically unlikely. It's just something that might be a little bit of an eyebrow raiser, So that's one thing. But then he has 5 other arguments that go into detail about the nature of this object, where he's like, this seems to fit the description of an artificial object. Okay, but, this has just been rejected out of hand by the skeptic community. I've listened to Avi Loeb. I think it's interesting, but I don't know about these things. I'm just listening to podcasts, while I drive. And, so I don't know any better, but I'm just listening to this guy. He's making sense to me. And then the way that he's treated by the skeptic community is like, it is so far out of line with their stated values, you know? And like I said, there's nothing about this that's in conflict with naturalism or in conflict with like natural law. It just seems like it's a reasonable hypothesis. Like, yeah, this strange object might be an artificial object. It might be some space junk, you know, it might be some kind of debris. It's not that like aliens are trying to make contact with us or something. It's just this thing that blew through our solar system. Maybe it was artificial and not natural. But it's completely rejected out of hand by skeptics. He even talks about some of the interactions he's had with skeptics, including one who says, I wish this thing, Oumuamua, I wish it never existed. That just flies in the face of the scientific attitude. It flies in the face of all stated values of skeptics and skepticism. And yeah, but that's the skeptic community. The reason I bring all this stuff up, you know, is not because I'm, you know, like a secret believer, but I'm open-minded to them because how would you know if you didn't check, you know? And I don't think any of those things are false by definition. I don't see any reason to be so upset about it. Yeah, I mean, I'm open to it. What I have seen is not at all what the skeptics told me I would see. So that was one of the major things that pushed me away from the skeptic community. I just wanted to mention first how I was a part of the skeptic community for you know, a few years and like gradually moved away from it, and why that was. So, you know, how old am I? I'm 26. I'm about to be 27. When I was, you know, 19, 20, 21, maybe even 22, I really didn't start moving away from the skeptic community until 3 or 4 years ago. And part of the reason, like I said, it was slowly realizing the things that I've mentioned so far, but the first thing was atheism and religion. So I'm an atheist. Most skeptics in the skeptic community at, you know, CFI or the Amazing Meeting or Skeptic's Guide to the Universe listeners, you know, they're pretty much all atheists. I kept getting in these disagreements with them, right? Where I was like, I'm like, hey, I'm an atheist, you're an atheist, but I think that your reasons are not very good. Like, I think you're kind of overconfident. They clearly had such certainty that God didn't exist. And I believe God doesn't exist, but I wasn't saying that God was like a belief in unicorns or something. And they would pay lip service sometimes to uncertainty. Then they would say things like God is like, you know, Santa Claus or believing in unicorns. It's like, well, I'm pretty certain that Santa Claus and unicorns don't exist. I mean, obviously not with like Cartesian certainty, but for all intents and purposes, I am certain that Santa Claus is not real. And so are you. And then you turn around and say belief in God is like Santa Claus. And I'm saying, how can you justify that degree of certainty? Like that doesn't, you know, again, I'm an atheist and I really don't take theistic beliefs all that seriously. It is, you know, in this category of things that like I kind of have to say might be true, but it would be so surprising to me if it turned out to be true. Very bad odds, but a lot better than like winning the lottery or something like that. Let me put it this way. If the odds of winning the lottery were the same as the odds of God existing, I would play the lottery every day. And it struck me as almost like you know, the same type of irrational certainty that you would find in religious communities, like people who had terrible reasons for their views and had such an unwarranted degree of certainty. And that was something that was a bit of a red flag for me. They really don't know what they're talking about when it comes to philosophy of religion. Like, they've come to the same conclusion as me, but they do not understand many of these issues. And many of the, not to sound too douchey about it, but like many of like the finer points of philosophy of religion. And it was just always this thing in the back of my mind, like, I guess this isn't one of their areas of expertise, you know? So the next thing that pushed me over the edge, though, was sort of political disputes that I would have with them. The skeptic community is socially liberal and fiscally conservative by and large. I don't know if they would all think of themselves that way, but I was fiscally to the left of them by a lot. James Randi, there are these stories with him and with the Amazing Meeting there was this woman named Rebecca Watson, I think, who used to be a part of Skeptics Guide to the Universe, and she would talk about like the sexual harassment at these like skeptic meetups, and like just the like people just trying to have sex with her, and like with other like 3 women who were there, just how fucking awkward it was. And she would complain about it. She would be like, hey, you know, someone like groped me, or someone did this, or someone is like hitting on, like I people, every fucking guy is like awkwardly propositioning me. And it's like, you know, so she'd complain about it, and then James Randi would, you know, tell her to knock it off with like the feminism bullshit, and you know, complain about her behind her back and stuff, and she eventually just like stops being a part of it. But it's not like anyone on the Skeptics Guide to the Universe would grope a woman at a conference, as far as I know. I mean, they don't, it doesn't seem like that, and I'm pretty sure Cara Santa Maria would vouch for them, and I'm pretty sure Rebecca Watson would vouch for them specifically. Oh, I do like Cara. I should mention that. I think that she's also a bit of an exception. She's more in the Michael Shermer camp, in my mind. She seems like sincere and open-minded. Anyway, so I would disagree with him about like political matters, though. You know, like, so this came to the fore with a lot of the 2016 primary. Holy shit, I hate myself even for mentioning it, but like the whole like Hillary versus Bernie thing, like, you know, I was squarely on the Bernie side of that, and I was just so disheartened by the fact that so many skeptics couldn't bring themselves to be skeptical of privatized healthcare. You know, and who's this guy? John something. He has a show on Blogging Heads TV, but he's also one of these people like me who's like, hey, you know, you might think I would find common cause with skeptics, but I really don't like this group. So he had some talk about how skeptics are incapable, seemingly, of being skeptical of war and arguments for war. So he lived through, you know, the Iraq War and Afghanistan, and talked about how the skeptic community was like absolutely useless during that period, and couldn't be skeptical of the just blatant propaganda and lies that were being told in support of the war effort. So he gave this talk at some skeptic meeting in like 2015 or 2016 or something, about how the skeptic community is skeptical of Bigfoot, but they can't bring it to themselves. They can't bring themselves to be skeptical about anything that fucking matters. And I felt the same way about like socialism and capitalism and like privatized, wanting socialized medicine, realizing that this was sort of the more rational way of doing things, and just seeing awful arguments against universal healthcare. Skeptic community does seem pretty united against Trump. Like I said, they're kind of like libs, but they weren't like me, and I was very disheartened by just how unwilling a lot of them were to actually debate these sorts of issues. And yeah, I really felt the way that guy did, whose name I can't remember, about just their unwillingness to engage in basic skepticism when it came to political matters. The skeptical community is like seemingly incapable of being skeptical of capitalism and arguments for capitalism. I'm not saying you've got to turn into an anti-capitalist, but it was just a bizarre credulity among skeptics when it came to the official state narrative about how things work. Once you learn about the sort of mechanisms that are at work in the United States educational system, not even thinking about like the Red Scare, where people were just removed from employment and blacklisted if they had the wrong kinds of views, but the more subtle mechanisms, the kind of filters that like Chomsky talks about that people need to pass through in order to have a job in academia. So it's like, once you internalize that sort of thing, just because someone is at an institution, and they have degrees, they have an education, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should believe anything they're saying. And just the way I am just inherently skeptical of official narratives from the state, from corporations, from corporate media. Skeptics do not have that. Like, people who are a part of the skeptic community, they love official narratives, and the things they love to debunk are things that are contrary to official narratives. So, I mean, just the political leanings of the skeptic community were very disheartening to me, but I was able to kind of compartmentalize and say, okay, but we still agree about all this non-political stuff. But even that fell apart. Take conspiracy theories, sort of related to the last topic. They painted a certain picture to me about what it is that conspiracy theorists believe and why they believe it and their thought process. And it was just so wrong. It was just so inaccurate. So Oliver Stone recently came out with a documentary about the JFK assassination. Oliver Stone is of the opinion that the CIA killed the president. It was sort of a coup. And it's the kind of thing they did in other countries. We know they did in other countries, and they sort of did the same thing here. So how I even got involved with the skeptic community just had to do with atheism. So I was an atheist. I became a part of the skeptic community as a result of that, and then suddenly I'm hearing about Bigfoot and JFK. The way that they presented JFK to me, in the sense of like, here's what conspiracy theorists believe. Here's how they formed these beliefs. It's mostly bullshit. Like, the way that they presented it to me, like, here's how they formed these beliefs. Here's what they believe. It was all wrong. The skeptics were just wrong. They just haven't looked into it. I don't know what they're doing. I don't know what they're, because they provide citations. They point to some, like, YouTube videos or articles, or, like, sometimes sometimes they'll debate some of these people. And I'm just like, where do you find these people? And part of what piqued my interest in it, was getting a little dose of it and then realizing that I had been just utterly misled by the skeptic community about what they believed and why. So here's one minor thing, and I've even heard Michael Shermer engage in this. Their model of how conspiracy theory beliefs form often falls into this category of what I would call anomaly hunting. So they think that they think conspiracy theorists, they find these anomalies, and they find little bits of information and data that don't quite fit the official narrative. So the official narrative, the Warren Commission, the 9/11 Commission report, like, all these things are clearly rock solid. But there are a few things that just don't fit. There are always a few things that don't fit. There's always noise, don't worry about it. And what conspiracy theorists do, they go anomaly hunting in the rubble of the towers. And then once they find these anomalies, they build these grand conspiracy theories based off nothing but these anomalies. And it's like, yeah, that's not at all what happens. Like, what happens typically is that there's an underlying worldview where the prior probability of certain events are higher than they would be if you had different background beliefs. So, for instance, many 9/11 truthers are left-wingers. They are people who are skeptical of the military-industrial complex. They have more knowledge than is healthy of the CIA and its activities, and they have a very cynical, pessimistic view of U.S. government and the people in it. So they think that someone like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and George Bush, they would have zero issue with killing American citizens to further their own political and economic goals. And anyone who thinks they're wrong about that point, I think, is a little delusional. And I think that does describe a lot of skeptics. A lot of skeptics are true believers in the system. They can't fathom how something could be on the news that's not real, unless, of course, it's Fox News. But like MSNBC, CNN, the New York Times, Washington Post, like, they cannot understand how something that's not true could be posted in one of those papers or on one of those channels, let alone an intentional lie. Maybe some people make mistakes, everyone makes mistakes, but it's all due to incompetence. It's never due to, like, intentionally lying, even though it could not be denied that the New York Times and Washington Post have deliberately lied in the past. It doesn't seem to faze skeptics, though. It doesn't seem to affect their worldview in any way. They sort of get the causal history of these beliefs totally wrong. And again, this is to say nothing of the quality of these beliefs. It's just about the causal history of the beliefs and whether you have an accurate model of that causal history or not. And what I'm saying is that skeptics don't. What's happening is that they have a broader worldview. And so they have, as a result, different priors in something like the conspiracy narrative surrounding 9/11. So the basic conspiracy narrative around 9/11, as I understand it, is something like the US government committed a false flag attack against its own citizens in order to provoke a war. The exact details about how that happened, they don't agree about, but they generally do agree that it was either allowed to happen or encouraged to happen, so that we could go to war and rally everyone into a frothing rage and then make, I don't know, a couple $1 trillion for military contractors, which is what happened. And further the political goals of, for instance, the Patriot Act, which is something that not only did the people in government want that for a long time because they kept tripping over these annoying civil liberties, but Dick Cheney specifically wanted something like the Patriot Act, or the things that were pushed through in the Patriot Act. He wanted that specifically for years in government. So it's just a fact that people like Dick Cheney got everything they ever wanted out of 9/11, except maybe to start even more wars. There's evidence that he wanted to start like 8 or 9 wars and only got 2 as a result of 9/11. So my deepest sympathies for him. But, it's just a fact that some of these people got everything they ever wanted from 9/11. So the question is, were they just incredibly fortunate and it was just really lucky? Or did they allow something to happen or encourage something to happen in order to further their political and material interests? So this is sort of the background for a lot of 9/11 truthers, where they're coming at this with different priors, and they know about Operation Northwoods, which was, a CIA plot to kill American citizens to start a war with Cuba, to justify those political ends. And the way that 9/11 truthers see their conspiracy theories about 9/11, they see 9/11 as like the culmination of Operation Northwoods. So that's how they see it. Now, I never heard any of that from skeptics. Ever. It was always just, they go rummaging through the rubble of the towers, or they say, hey, this camera footage is weird. And then they elaborate, they just blow things up into this enormous conspiracy, and this whole worldview just off the basis of jet fuel can't melt steel beams. So they go from jet fuel can't melt steel beams to this worldview about how everything else works, and that's irrational. And it's like, well, yeah, it would be if that's what was happening, but this is what I mean where I say, like, skeptics just don't actually understand what they're criticizing. They don't understand how these beliefs are formed, and they don't to even understand what the beliefs are. Like, I never heard about Northwoods from skeptics, when they were talking about 9/11 truthers. All I ever heard was, well, jet fuel can compromise the integrity of this building, even though it can't melt steel beams. Case closed. 9/11 truthers are all crazy. The end. Or they would, like I said, they would just pick out the craziest person who's a 9/11 truther and then knock them down and act like the whole thing had been debunked. I feel like I have to say this over and over again. This is not necessarily an endorsement of these theories. I'm just saying that skeptics had completely misrepresented to me what the theories were and why anyone believed them. So, and this happened over and over again. Okay, so it started with the atheism, right? Like, it started with, they just have this completely unwarranted degree of certainty that they're right about atheism. And again, I agree with their conclusion there, but the way they got there is like so inadequate. So I just wanted to jump in here with a case study that illustrates my frustration with the skeptic community, and that would be that of torture and the 9/11 Commission. So here's a controversial principle. You can't trust testimony that was obtained through torture. Quote, the analysis shows that much of what was reported about the planning and execution of the terror attacks on New York and Washington was derived from the interrogations of high-ranking al-Qaeda operatives. Each had been subjected to, quote-unquote, enhanced interrogation techniques, end quote. So they go on to explain that what they're talking about, among other things, is waterboarding. And back then it was actually debated whether waterboarding was torture. So continuing along here, the NBC News analysis shows that more than 1/4 of all footnotes in the 9/11 report refer to CIA interrogations of al-Qaeda operatives who were subjected to the now controversial interrogation techniques. Specifically, the NBC News analysis shows 441 of the more than 1,700 footnotes in the Commission's final report refer to the CIA interrogations. So let's return to that truism that you shouldn't believe testimony obtained through torture. I don't think it's very skeptical of them to believe testimony that was obtained through torture at Guantanamo or Abu Ghraib or God knows what else. The situation that we're in is that the official state narrative is based in large part on torture, but pointing this out disqualifies you from being a skeptic. And I haven't endorsed any particular theory about 9/11 here. I'm only casting doubt on one particular theory. That's because 25% of it is based on torture. This strikes me as basic skepticism and intellectual honesty, but there is no way to broach this topic in the skeptic community. The skeptical position, apparently, is to trust testimony that was obtained through torture. So let me put this into an argument, and you can tell me if I've committed any logical fallacies. Premise 1, conclusions supported by information gained by torture are suspect. Premise 2, the 9/11 Commission's conclusions were supported by information gained from torture. Therefore, their conclusions are suspect. So if it makes me a conspiracy theorist to doubt testimony that was obtained through torture, then yeah, sign me up. I'm a conspiracy theorist. And if you think that you can trust that testimony that was obtained through enhanced interrogation techniques, then have fun at the next Skeptic convention. You'll be in good company. Again, I'm not putting forward any theory myself. I'm looking at one particular theory and pointing out a massive flaw. This is a theory that skeptics endorse, and it seems pretty, unskeptical of them. It doesn't really seem in line with their professed values. But, it's uncomfortable. I mean, you don't want to be labeled a 9/11 truther. So for me, it's just a matter of intellectual honesty. Like, are you willing to say this sort of thing despite the fact that people will say nasty things about you? But I mean, for me, it just comes down to that fact that you can't trust testimony that was obtained through torture. Stumbling across some of these conspiracy theories, like the JFK thing, I actually checked up on Stephen Novella's blog about JFK conspiracy stuff after I had watched Oliver Stone's documentary and listened to a few podcasts about, it's called True Anon. I listened to a few episodes of True Anon about the JFK stuff. And I was just hearing things I'd never heard before, which was really strange because I had listened to skeptics talk about these topics for hours, about 9/11 and JFK. And I had never heard what these other people were telling me. These people who actually believed in 9/11 truther conspiracies and JFK conspiracies. People who reject the 9/11 Commission report and people who reject the Warren Commission. When I was hearing it from them, it's like, this is nothing like what skeptics told me about. And like I said, I checked in recently on Stephen Novella's blog and skimmed through several blog posts just to see if I could find, the kinds of things about JFK that I'd been hearing from him. Like, does he address this? And the answer is no. So this same thing happened with parapsychology. And this finally brings us to Mr. James Randi. So the $1 million challenge. So a lot of people appeal to the $1 million paranormal challenge as conclusive proof that there are no ghosts, there are no psychic abilities, there's nothing parapsychological that is veridical. So the thing is that challenge was not a genuine offer. It was a publicity stunt. And let me just read you something from journalist and NPR producer Stacey Horn. This is what she says about her encounter with James Randi. I had an exchange with Randi because I was going to have the following sentences about his $1 million prize in my book. To date, Randi's $1 million prize has not been awarded, but according to Chris Carter, author of Parapsychology and the Skeptics, Randi backs off from any serious challenge. I always have an out, he's been quoted as saying. I sent that to Randi and asked him if he really said that. He wrote back, saying that the quote was true but incomplete. What he really said was, I always have an out. I'm right. It seemed like he thought he was being amusing, but I didn't really know a lot about him yet. But it also seemed to indicate that the $1 million prize might not really be a serious offer. So I asked him how a decision was made. Was there a committee, and who was on it? He replied, "If someone claims that they can fly by flapping their arms, the results don't need any decision. What committee? Why would a committee be required? I don't understand the question." At that point, I just wrote him off and decided not to mention his prize in my book since it just seemed like a publicity stunt for Randy. So, that sums it up for me. Like, just there's a lot more detail to uncover about that prize specifically and some of the people who have tried to go through with it. A lot of them are cranks, obviously, but it's not a serious offer is the bottom line. I think he was just a total pseudo-skeptic who basically cashed in on telling skeptics what they wanted to hear. Like, that $1 million prize was not a sincere offer. There's lots of evidence to suggest that was never a sincere offer and that he put this ridiculous undue burden on people. And then again, whenever people question it, they hone in on the nut jobs, on the craziest, the craziest people who applied for it and complained about it, and then be like, yeah, and these are the people who complain about the $1 million prize. These are the people who complained that it wasn't really an offer that was a serious offer. There were all these legal tricks that were played, all these bizarre requirements. Some of them were totally ad hoc. Yeah, so I want to get into the weeds on that if I make an episode about this. I'm pulling this up from Will Storr, who is a reporter for The Telegraph. Here's what Storr had to say. More recently, I've begun to wonder about Randy's educational foundation, the JREF, which claims tax-exempt status in the U.S. and is partly dependent on public donations. I wondered what the actual educative work the organization actually did. And he mentions that it had an average revenue of $1.2 million per year. Financial documents reveal that just $5,100 on average was being spent on grants. There are some ebooks, videos, and lesson plans on subjects such as fairies on their website. They organize an annual fan convention. James Randi over that period has been paid an average annual salary of $195,000. My requests for details of the Educational Foundation's educational activities over the last 12 months were dodged and then ignored. So more than 20% of the foundation's total yearly revenue was spent on executive compensation. And according to an analysis of 100,000 nonprofit CEO salaries, this figure nearly triples the average compensation in JREF's revenue class. So he was paying himself 3 times the average compensation of other nonprofits in its own revenue class, not compared to all nonprofits, just the ones that are comparable. And so he was paying himself quite a lot of money from JREF, which seemingly didn't do anything. Just that whole quote about like, what committee, what decision? If someone tells me they can fly by flapping their arms, does that require a committee? I don't understand the question. So the skeptic community, The skeptic community. They've consistently misled me. They have consistently shown themselves to be overconfident dorks, basically, who just have these unjustified, unwarranted beliefs that have the right aesthetics. Like this is what a respectable person would believe. They go off of vibes. They go off of the aesthetics of other beliefs. I can't find an official narrative that they don't believe. I just don't understand how these people are genuine skeptics. They don't seem like real skeptics to me. You would think that skeptical inquiry, if it were genuine, would occasionally lead one away from the status quo. It would occasionally lead one against the official narrative of the state or of massive corporations. It never seems to, though, It's amazing that, skepticism always leads certain people to reify the status quo and official narratives, be it political, scientific, philosophical, to one untrained in the art of critical thinking. It might appear as if skepticism is just a way of justifying what they were already going to believe anyway. So I think that I will leave it there. I'm not a part of the skeptic community. I haven't been for years. I guess I just don't think they're real skeptics or involved in any kind of genuine pursuit of the truth. There are exceptions, like I mentioned. I think that Cara Santa Maria seems genuinely open-minded. She's a co-host of Skeptics Guide and a host of a podcast called Talk Nerdy. Michael Shermer, editor of Skeptic Magazine, I think is an exception. But I'm going off of my experiences at CFI and in online skeptic groups. I think that pseudo-skepticism abounds. I think they're mostly vibes-based, and they have some justifications for things that make them sound reasonable, but I think it was kind of predetermined where they were going to end up. Whether it's JFK, whether it's 9/11, whether it's parapsychology, whether it's ghost believers, whether it's I don't really care about all that unserious crap that they insist on talking about, like Bigfoot or whatever, but when it comes to the other stuff, even theism, it is just a fact that the skeptic community consistently misrepresents what people believe and why they believe it. So I will actually leave it there. Of course, I've been Emerson Green, as you know. You're patrons after all, so I'd be surprised if you didn't, but thank you for supporting the show, and I will talk to you next time.